early 2000s called Machu Picchu, I believe. I will be going into depth on the significance behind it and what it meant and all of that good stuff. And then identity, race, and literature in 19th century culture or 19th century Brazil. I want to talk about Brazil's journey through being, a primarily slave slavery economic based country for a while, and how they kind of shift that during the end of the 19th, 20th century. And then politics, identity, and inequality by literature in Mexico. We'll be looking at the time where Mexico is going through its own independence, trying to gain its own independence, and a various amount of leaders going in and out, and the hardships that were along with that, but as well as a lot of many beneficial things that Mexican culture still carries on to this day. And then women and mining conflicts in Ecuador and Peru. Um, Basically, we'll be looking at large corporations who we'll be looking at large corporations and their want to extract large mining, or they want to mine and extract from lakes a lot of gold. And these people in Ecuador and Peru need that water to survive. And we'll be going into depth about how those women handle that situation and the revolutionary thoughts that they had, as well as lastly, Latin American urbanized. We'll be talking about the urbanization of Latin America and how that relates to the relationship between the countryside and the city, some of the effects that occurred through that, and some of the positives that occurred through that. So we're going to start off with Chile. In Module 7, we talked about how politics, gender inequality, and violence can all be depicted through dramas or films. And in many cases, it does help us understand what's going on a little bit better because we're getting a visual. With Chile specifically, Salvador Allende was shifting the narrative and creating a reform within the government. And it was all centered around equality and peace, a very humanitarian socialist movement. It was going really well until the United States became worried about the socialist movement during the whole communist phase, and they decided to aid General Pinochet. The best way I could describe it is he's kind of like an authoritarian military dictatorship type leadership. So United States aid Pinochet in overthrowing Salvador Allende, except Pinochet kind of goes overboard. He starts a military coup that just spreads a ton of violence and mass killings of just a ton of innocent people. And the movie Machuca, I think that's how you say it, depicts this whole situation very well. It also, but on top of that, and more than that, it kind of shows the struggles of everyday life that you would see between the working class and the middle class, which is what the battle was really between within Chile. It was the working class saying we want to be represented more and we want more rights, and the wealthy elites being like, okay, I'm scared about how that's going to react to me and what that means for my life. So I don't want you guys to have that. Um, so although the working class was a majority of the population, the fear that I was talking about was enough to stop the socialist movement. And I think the movie paints a perfect picture of the monstrosities that did occur during Pinochet's military coup. Afterwards, the scene where the coup is occurring and you see the families running and everyone's screaming and crying, and it's all terrifying. And then, all of that stuff, it depicts it as well as I think a movie can. Moving on to Brazil. In Module 4, we talked about Brazil and its birth as a country. Uh, Brazil was first ruled by Pedro I, and everything was pretty peaceful. When he left, though, for Portugal, he left his 5-year-old son in charge, and quite obviously, 5-year-old son was not ready to take over. So it became a lot of different voices coming in and created a lot of conflict. But once he did become Pedro II, once he did come of age, he began to turn Brazil into that international power force. A large reason for their success and power was because of slavery, as I said before. Um, However, Brazil did abolish slave trade in 1950 from Britain pressure. They were actually one of the last countries to abolish slavery. And that was because their whole economic system was built around slavery. However, out of that situation, the best writer ever out of Brazil was born. I might butcher his name, but Joaquim Maria Machado de Assis. Machado created a literary nonprofit called Academia de Letras Brasileiras and shifted the narrative this is the big one. He shifted the narrative of Brazil to focus on the positives and wasn't just all about slave trade and all of those things. So then we're moving on to Mexico. In Module 6, we focus primarily on the Mexican Revolution and the effects it had on the identity and literature of Mexico. So Francisco A. Madero began the Mexican Revolution by announcing re-elections were void with a call to arms. It was pretty shocking. Before Madero threw Diaz, Diaz supported and strengthened landowners, the church, and the industry. After Diaz took over, Mexico became very divided. The lower class were fighting for the ejidos to keep their land, and the wealthy wanted to keep what they obtained under Diaz's rule. This division led to Huerta betraying Madero and taking over the presidency. However, all of Mexico and Woodrow Wilson vowed to take him down, and eventually he resigned. After that, many different influential leaders held power at different times. Some of these leaders are Carranza, Villa, and Zapata. Carranza ended up establishing himself as president in 1917 and would begin implementing a new constitution that same year. Although he was implementing this constitution, he ended up being assassinated in 1919, and he didn't really get to mold the new constitution into what he wanted it to be. All of this pain and suffering that Mexico was going through, the division throughout the 1900s, birthed into a new literary movement called the New Narrative. This new narrative was full of dreamlike characteristics, changed the point of view and opened structures and ending, and writers analyzing and reflecting specific historical situations. Out of this birth of the new narrative was Juan Rulfo, and he specialized in portraying these dreamlike characteristics through his writings and the New World narrative within Mexico. And he is a very influential leader when it comes to literature throughout the Mexican Revolution. Right. Women and mining conflicts in Ecuador and Peru. So in Module 11, we focused on the mining conflicts in Ecuador and Peru, including the women's revolutionary response to the injustices. Pachamama, I don't know how to say that, I'm sorry. But they believed it was the mother goddess, and it carried multiple meanings with fire, earth, water, etc. The Andean culture used Pachamama to define all the water on native Andean land. It is recognized as an entity within the rights of the Ecuadorian Constitution. For many people, Pachamama is vital for their way of living in everyday life. However, many large corporations throughout Latin America want to empty the many large natural bodies of water to extract the gold and create mines that were generating large amounts of money, and this would completely pollute the water. Women in Ecuador and Peru did not like this, and originally and traditionally, they do not speak up. They have a lot of responsibilities in the house, and especially on political views, they don't really make themselves heard. However, they felt like this was a special case to begin to protest and fight the civil fight. And in many different ways, they created groups and like activist groups specifically to oppose the mining that was happening. Um, Throughout this time, women in Ecuador were given a chance to speak to the public, step into their roles as leaders, and they were given opportunities like radio interviews, community gatherings, and collective gardens. Lastly, Latin America urbanization. So in Module 9, we focused on the agrarian reform and its connection to urbanization. The agrarian reform was largely a move towards privatization, specifically land registrations and titling or land tax issues that benefited the wealthy elites. Faced with the inability to afford their land, speaking of the farmers, a large majority of these rural farm owners began to move to the city during this urbanization period. The economic displacement of these small rural farmers led to the same challenges within the city. Wealthy elites were capitalizing on the insignificance of the rural farmers within the economy, and they left no room to capitalize with the situation they were given. Professor Cahout says that these wealthy elites leave the rest of the economy to fend for themselves. And to further this point, 80% of the land in Latin America is held by only 1% of the population, while that other 20% is held by 99. So due to these large corporations and landholders exhorting all opportunities in the city the same way they did in the countryside, the land and the people in the highly urbanized areas were left devastated. The modern labor force in Latin America, which was made up of past rural farms, were forced into an informal economy where they had to fend for themselves. And basically, an informal economy is when you don't have the money, nor you're not in the situation to go to someone else to get something fixed or anything like that. So you end up just doing everything yourself, like working on your house, building your home, doing all these sorts of things. You end up doing it yourself. And that's what an informal economy is. The largely urbanized areas that these people stayed in became classified as slums, which was a largely populated area that receives little to no economical support. How do these 5 concepts tie together? So they're all related because all of these countries or all of these specific situations represent an arduous journey and many awful things that occurred. But however, many influential literature figures were born out of all this turmoil, or a lot of positive situations that we can look at. In Mexico, Juan Rulfo's father had gone through the Mexican Revolution, and that is reflected through his literature. In Chile, the movie Machuca was birthed in order to accurately depict the horrid events that occurred. Joaquim Maria Machado de Assis is known as the best writer to come out of Brazil, and he also helped shift the narrative coming out of Brazil. The people in Ecuador and Peru were facing the risk of their water being mass polluted when the women began to stand up, protest, and let their voices be heard, which put a stop to it. Urbanization in Latin America is viewed as primarily negative, and although there are negative traits like Latin America's expedited urbanization, Latin America's expedited urbanization was to a level that the world has never seen before, just how fast it occurred. I think if they were backed by the government and wealthy elites, that rapid urbanization could have been something that was beneficial, more so than negative. But I think the point of all this is to show that these 5 different influential figures or moments share the cultures and struggles of each different country.